Heat Stroke by Dr. DSB. Read by My Lost and Found. Summary. Hitoshi should have stayed on campus. No, he really should have stayed on campus. None of this bullshit would have happened if he'd stayed in his room all day, or hell, if he'd just biked through the woods around school rather than deciding he just had to go out into the city for a few hours. Whatever entity dealt out bad days had it out for him. Of that, Hitoshi was certain. The situation he was in, 3 older, bigger boys standing between him and any escape, cornered behind the convenience store he'd stopped at for a snack, was proof enough of that. Hitoshi went out for a bike ride on a hot summer day and ends up encountering 3 guys who saw him at the sports festival. When he refuses to help them rob a store, they end up using his scapser scarf against him. This fic is about 11.4k words and 1 chapter. As always, link to this fic is in the description below, as well as any relevant trigger warnings, and this one does have one that you wouldn't really expect. So, if you're prepared, let's get on with the story. Hitoshi should have stayed on campus. No, he really should have stayed on campus. None of this bullshit would have happened if he'd stayed in his room all day, or hell, if he'd just biked through the woods around the school rather than deciding he just had to go out into the city for a few hours. Whatever entity dealt out bad days had it out for him. Of that, Hitoshi was certain. The situation he was in, 3 older, bigger boys standing between him and any escape, cornered behind the convenience store he'd stopped at for a snack, was proof enough of that. They'd found him contemplating the disgusting snack cakes and candy bars, the biggest of the 3 throwing a heavy arm over Hitoshi's shoulder, like they were old friends. His initial reaction had been to just shrug the guy off, to duck out from under the touch like he did to most others. But something sharp in the other guy's hand jabbed him in the side. He hadn't been able to see what it was. Knife, nail, it could have been a pencil for all he knew. But he wasn't about to chance getting stabbed in the fucking snack aisle on a Sunday. Hey, you were in the UA Sports Festival, right? The guy crooned, voice faux friendly even as he used his weight to drag Hitoshi closer to him. It wasn't the first time Hitoshi had been recognized from the festival, but he had a feeling it'd be the worst. The other occasions hadn't exactly been nice either. Lots of people had been upset how he'd used his quirk, and the 2 kids dropped out of the final event because of him hadn't won him any fans. But this felt like it was a bit different from those. He'd barely listened as they cajoled him, too busy looking around for security cameras. They'd been in a blind spot, though he doubted it'd been on purpose since they'd come to him. It was just dumb fucking luck. So, in an effort to at least get all their faces on camera, he'd suggested they take things outside. Maybe they thought he was going along with whatever they wanted. Something about brainwashing the cashier, helping them rob the store. Fuck that. Or perhaps they were really that dumb. But they'd walked out with him, ignorant of the meaningful eye contact Hitoshi made with the sole camera that would catch all their faces as they passed. If anything was going to happen to him, Hitoshi was going to make sure a camera saw who was involved. Get off me! Hitoshi snarled, trying to throw one of the boys, the only one taller than him, but thin like he was, rather than broad like the big one. Get off him by shifting their combined weight and stepping sharply. It was a move Aizawa taught him, but apparently he'd need to revise it again because rather than throwing the guy off balance, they both stumbled. Hitoshi was nothing if not an improviser, though, using their new momentum to shove his shoulder into the kid's chest and slam him back into the brickwork they'd pinned Hitoshi to less than a minute before. Things got aggressive when they figured out he wasn't going to cooperate. Then, when he tried to leave, that aggression turned to outright violence. Okay, so maybe Hitoshi might have said something to help it along, but he had a feeling they would have gone there eventually, even if he kept his mouth shut. Assholes like them didn't take no for an answer. The 3rd boy, dark red hair and skin a light shade of blue, had grabbed his backpack and yanked it off him. That old anxiety of living out of that bag, of everything important to him being inside, had him a little frantic, even if all it had for today was a few essentials for his day trip into town. While the redhead pawed through his belongings, the big guy tried to help the tall one restrain Hitoshi. He was a little proud of how much trouble they were having, even with their size difference. Maybe Aizawa's training was already showing results. Maybe I am getting better. Until a hand went to grab the collar of his shirt, missed, and caught him around the throat. His breathing seized in his chest, and for the one singular moment where his mind tried to drag him somewhere else, all the times he'd been choked. When he was 7, when he was 10, 11, 13, gave them all the opportunity they needed to slam his head back against that brick wall again. He saw stars at the impact, slumping forward as the boys let his weight drag all 3 of them down to the hot asphalt. Even dazed, Hitoshi tried to flail and scramble away, kicking and swinging wildly as he tried to force his vision to stabilize and the dark spots to clear. The big guy climbed on top of him, using his weight to press down on the hand around Hitoshi's throat until he managed to knock the arm away. Hitoshi gasped, shoving back the flashback that the weight and touch dredged to the surface. He should use his quirk. This counted as self-defense, right? Was it legal to use your quirk in self-defense? He still didn't know if these guys had a knife, and he really didn't want to die getting jumped by 3 nobody assholes less than half a dozen kilometers from school. He should use his quirk. But he didn't. Couldn't. The words got caught up in his throat like the memory of a hand. Broader, older than the kids he was fighting, and too hot in the summer heat wave, stinking of cigarette smoke and cheap booze, touching him softly while the guy's weight pressed down on his abdomen. Too hot, too heavy. Had physically grabbed a hold of them. "Hold still!" the big guy snapped, grabbing Hitoshi by the hair and forehead like he was trying to hold on to a bull's horns, as Hitoshi bucked and twisted, managing to get halfway onto his side. He used his new hold to slam Hitoshi's head down into the asphalt, his temple colliding something sharp. Something split. He felt the slight pop of skin breaking against that intense pressure, the pain of the cut bright against the all-encompassing throb of the impact. Hitoshi still tried to kick and thrash, and there was another weight on one of his legs, hands grabbing the other to try to get it down and pinned too. What the fuck is this pottage shit? That was the third one, the redhead, sounding bewildered, disgusted, but what he found after dumping Hitoshi's bag. Bondage shit? He didn't carry the muzzle around anymore. Thank fucking God. He hadn't had to wear it since he moved into the dorms. So what the hell was the kid talking about? He grabbed the hand still holding his head down, short, blunt nails digging in and twisting. He felt a pop there too, as he broke through the skin and blood rushed up around the new cuts. The kid hissed, but rather than let go, he dragged Hitoshi's head up again and slammed it back down. The impact knocked him unconscious. It couldn't have been for more than a few seconds, though, because they were still on top of him when he came to. The hand on his face was gone, but there was still one in his hair, and the weight of people on top of him was suffocating. All at once, Hitoshi wasn't in some alleyway in Mustafa anymore, not pinned by 2 older boys in the heat of the day in August, his first year of high school. He wasn't 16 anymore. No, he was back in that apartment, waking up to one of Mrs. Shibukawa's guests leaning over him on his futon. It was the summer when he turned 11, and had been sweltering without any air conditioning or a fan. He'd gone to bed in a daze from the heat, wearing just a t-shirt and boxer briefs. There'd been only one set of hands, but it was at his throat, not holding tight, but touching, caressing, while the other one combed through his hair. Breath that stank of alcohol had washed over his cheek as the middle-aged businessman nuzzled his face, sticky wet lips brushing his jaw. He panicked, lashing out. He needed to get away. He didn't want whatever was going to happen to him. Get off! His voice cracked in the same way it had that night. Prepubescent then, frantic now. Someone grabbed his wrists as he tried to scratch and shove. Shut up, for fuck's sake! He only got one of them, the one on his leg. But before he could give any orders, a hand let go of one wrist and a fist collided with his jaw. Those black spots crowded his vision again, and in his concussed state, something was shoved into his mouth and wrapped tight around his head. Something pulled his hair with a pinch. That'll shut him up. Ha! The red hair sneered. Hitoshi wasn't sure if the impact severed his connection to the boy's mind, or if somebody jostled the guy enough to break him out of his mad scramble to pin him while he wasn't fighting back. There were too many hands on him, too much weight holding him down. Roll him over. I've got an idea. That was the redhead again. And no, let me go. Hitoshi couldn't breathe through whatever they'd shoved into his mouth, too panicked to focus. He struggled, but his attempts were sluggish and uncoordinated from the repeated blows to the head, and he couldn't breathe. The hot asphalt burned and scraped roughly against his face, arms, and exposed calves as he was flipped onto his stomach. The boys dragged his hands behind his back, and he felt whatever they tied around his head to gag him, tug, pulling his neck at an odd angle as the same fabric wrapped around his wrists. No! He bucked and twisted, managing to get a hand free, and he tried to shove himself up, to roll his weight and dislodge the solid mass that pinned his lower back. The fabric, his fucking capture scarf, had one of his wrists, and then they wrapped it around his neck and face, blindfolding him as they yanked his head back. Stop squirming! You're the one carrying around this bondage crap. We're just trying to help. The big guy laughed, and Hitoshi sobbed. They'd caught the hand he'd managed to free, fastening that wrist to the other elbow and looping the cloth too tight. The other hand was pulled between his shoulder blades, and when he tried to move it, the lengths they'd wrapped around his throat pulled tighter. This couldn't have been happening. It couldn't. Hitoshi tried to scream. Quit crying, bitch! He should have used his quirk when he had the chance. He should have stayed on campus. He shouldn't have woken up that morning. They grabbed at his legs, and he frantically kicked, movements even more uncoordinated now that he could barely breathe through the pressure around his throat and the cloth in his mouth. The unyielding fabric of his own fucking weapon was gagging, blindfolding, choking him as the weight of panic and a body at least twice his weight pressed down on him. One of his shoes came off in the struggle, and in the end, they only managed to get one leg wrapped up with the binding cloth, ankle pulled towards his arms, and the calf haphazardly bound to his thigh, since they had to stay sitting on him to keep that one down. They at least couldn't get his pants off like this. Small mercies. When they had Hitoshi well and truly hogtied, they'd step back to admire their work and catch their breath. Hitoshi couldn't seem to catch his own, too busy panicking, struggling even as it only worked his bonds tighter, especially around his delicate throat. He couldn't even hear what they were saying through the pounding of his heartbeat, blood rushing in his ears, his ragged breath swaying in and out of his chest as he tried to get enough air through the metal and fabric weave, through the tight pinch around his neck. He was dizzy, lightheaded. He was going to pass out. That summer, when he woke up to hands on him and a much bigger body straddling his body, where he lay on his futon, he'd managed a lot better than this. He'd shouted, terrified and desperate, when the man tried to shush him, voice soft and a mockery of soothing, as he slurred through the sound. Hitoshi had grabbed hold of the guy's mind with both hands and yanked. His broken, terrified plea for the man to get off him had been followed with the stilted, erratic, broken marionette movements of someone under his quirk's control. He made the guy leave, walk out the door, half naked, and keep walking, and held on to the connection until his head felt like it would split in two and his nose bled. The moment the guy passed the threshold of his bedroom, Hitoshi slammed the door shut behind him and locked it. Then he triple-checked the lock, just to be sure. He'd been so tired the night before, he must have forgotten. Even now, years later, he still triple-checked every lock, especially before going to sleep. Hitoshi wondered how this trauma would change him. He wondered if it'd even get the chance to. He still didn't know if they had a knife, if they planned to use it. Where his struggling tapered off, just for a moment, so he could catch his breath, it kicked up again, feeble despite how desperate Hitoshi was, when he felt hands on him. They grabbed at his jogging shorts, groping in his pockets. He tried to make a noise, anything coherent enough and intentional enough to throw his quirk behind. But even if he caught them, what then? Hold them until somebody came and found him? It wasn't like he could give any orders, even if he managed to get all three to respond by some miracle. He sobbed, kicking with his one free leg. And then, the hands were gone. God, this guy is fucking broke. I thought UA was a school for rich kids. They grabbed his wallet. He heard the faux leather bifold hit the ground by his head. He only had a few hundred yen on him. He'd left most of his money at the dorms, so he wouldn't be tempted to spend it on junk. His phone is a piece of shit too. Look! The tall one scoffed, sounding disappointed, and he heard them throw his phone too. The clatter of the cheap plastic of his prepaid flip phone against the asphalt sounded further away. What a fucking joke. Come on, at least we can get a few games from the arcade out of this. See ya, freak. The redhead called, and Hitoshi heard their footsteps as the three walked away. They walked away. Relief flooded Hitoshi's body, and he could have cried with the rush of it. His eyes felt a little damp behind the abrasive fabric they'd used to blindfold him. But he wasn't even upset about the tears. He'd been so scared. Getting hogtied by his capture scarf and left to be found was fine compared to his worst fears. He could handle this humiliation. It was hot, and the sun and fear had already made him sweat through his thin t-shirt. But he didn't even care. He worked to steady his breathing, flexing his fingers and touching each to the tip of his thumb to try to keep the feeling in them while he waited. Somebody would find him. He just had to be patient for a while. He wished he was anywhere else but laid out on hot asphalt in the view of the midday sun. But he'd handle it. He just needed to hold on. Wait a little while. He could handle it. When Kayama texted asking for a favor, Shota had been absolutely prepared to refuse outright. After all, it was his day off, and even if he'd been awake for over an hour now, he was enjoying luxuriating in bed with Hisashi. They so rarely got to have these slow days, and getting to listen to his husband's breathing, the slow beat of his heart where Shota rested his head on the other's chest, while long, gentle fingers combed through his hair for just a bit longer, was well worth the wheedling and pouting he'd endure from Kayama come morning. Later, he'd be very glad he hadn't refused outright. To his brisk question of what the hell she wanted, she'd asked if he could go find and retrieve a student who'd stayed off campus past their allotted time. One very particular, specific student. Hitoshi Shinso. Kayama would have gone herself, but one of her kids was having a bit of a breakdown, and she couldn't be in two places at once. The fact that it was Shinso explained why she hadn't gotten a hound dog to help. The prickle of anxiety and dread, cold and crawling in his gut and along the back of his neck like a many-legged thing from his nightmares, had Shota switching to Shinso's contact info in his phone and pressing call. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, before it went to an automated voicemail. He hung up, stood, and started dressing without a word. Hisashi sat up, worry creasing his brow as he knocked his glasses back down from where they'd sat on his forehead. "Sho? What's up? What's wrong?" he asked, voice heavily accented and clumsy without hearing aids. Even after years of wearing them, he'd never quite gotten the hang of making the sounds right if he couldn't hear them. Said they felt the same, so how was he supposed to fix it? Shota didn't care enough to ask him to try. An accent was an accent, and there were plenty more difficult to understand than Hizashi's. It let them communicate. That was all he cared about. Shota stopped to turn and face him, tucking the shirt he'd been about to pull on under one arm to free up his hands for sign language. "Nothing. Maybe. Shinso." The boy's sign name was a combination of the first character of his surname, Heart, and Cat. Hizashi's first suggestion had been Heart and Sun, but seeing as Shinso had recently started learning JSL from Hizashi, that felt a little too presumptuous, and far too close to an ache in Shota's chest for something as casual as a name. "Went for a bike ride into town. Late coming back," Shota signed, keeping things concise so he could explain things to Hizashi and get back to dressing. The furrow in his husband's brow only deepened, and he reached over to the bedside table to grab his hearing aids. Shota went back to getting dressed. "He was excited to go out this weekend. Apparently missed biking through the city," Shota continued, hoping to assuage both their anxieties. It was logical that Shinso had simply lost track of time. The teenager loved biking. There was a reason he had chosen an hour-long ride to and from school, rather than the far quicker train ride back before the dorms were erected. Shota wouldn't have been surprised if Shinso was already on his way back, cursing his lapse in timekeeping. But Shinso would have texted midnight if that were the case. That many-legged creature crawled inside Shota's heart and chest, curling tight around his lungs as he zipped his jumpsuit and fastened his belt. The Camino Ward incident was so recent. Only a few weeks ago, Bakugo had been taken from a supposedly secret secure summer camp, and in the process of his rescue, the world had lost its symbol of peace and more significant crime deterrent. The area around UA was public property and readily accessible, and Shinso was known as a UA student since he'd appeared on national television during the sports festival. Shota felt sick. Not like him to forget, though, and 4 hours is a long time. Somebody could cover a lot of ground in 4 hours, even without a quirk like Kurogiri's warp gate. With it, Shinso could be halfway across Japan in minutes, much less 4 hours. Hizashi hadn't meant to worsen Shota's anxiety, but that was the comment's effect. His hands shook as he grabbed his goggles from their almost reverential spot on the bedside table, pulling them down over his head to hang around his neck. "I'll drive," Hizashi said, throwing aside the thin sheet that kept him halfway decent all morning, so he could get up and grab the underwear from the nearest bureau. Shota nearly argued, but driving would be faster, no matter where Shinso was. He ran a shaky hand through his hair and clicked the link Kayama had shared with her message, using his biometrics to open and sign in to the app Nezu had set up to track UA students. The kid's phone was so crap and cheap, it didn't have any location services, so Powerloader had crafted and jerry-rigged a tracker onto it to use with Nezu's app. The location services allowed teachers and UA staff to keep track of students when they left campus, and the tracker Powerloader made would work until they came up with a better, long-term solution for Shinso. Hizashi had already ordered a phone for Shinso, a far newer smartphone, but not the latest model, so the kid wouldn't freak out too badly. He'd added him to the plan, and he and Shota started. Nezu was intent on reimbursing them the extra cost. Not that they needed it, and they were just waiting for the thing to arrive by mail. Shota was already brainstorming ways of getting around the kid's pride. Make it a safety issue, not a charity one. That it was a school thing from Nezu, not Hizashi and Shota, to ensure he actually accepted the phone. The app came up with a swipe of Shota's thumbprint, a map with Shinso's school ID, photo pinned to it. His bored, flat gaze, staring up at Shota like an incrimination. He wasn't far, only a few kilometers away, but not moving. Shota wished the head of support course had made a way to tell how long the tracker had been in one given place. But since it only pinged the satellites when the app activated, there was no way of knowing. 4 hours was a long time to be unaccounted for. While Shota dressed in his hero costume, Hazashi didn't take the time to don his. It was too much of a production, between his hair and all the layers, and even with how little time it took the man to throw on some khaki shorts, a t-shirt, and some socks, Shota was ready to leave without him. He left the front door before his husband got his pants on. When he finished lacing up his boots and putting on his capture scarf, Hazashi was at his side, stepping into his sneakers and pulling his hair back, an elastic tie between his teeth. Shota grabbed Hazashi's keys from the landing tray by the genkin and walked out the door with Hazashi barely a step behind him, readily relinquishing the gaudy keychain when a hand came to tug it from his grasp. He only half paid attention to the walk down the stairs and to the faculty parking lot, too focused on his phone. The dot still hadn't moved. Powerloader's trackers pinged the satellite every 10 seconds, and the app had a timer to show how much time was left before the next ping. Shota could even shorten it to every 2 or 3 seconds if he wanted to, but he was reluctant since it drew power from Shinso's phone. If Shinso's phone died, the tracker did too, and they'd only have the last known location. It was why the tracker's GPS only activated when accessed, rather than passively tracking like most other students' phones had. As he and Hazashi got in the car, he turned his screen to show his husband the address. Hazashi hummed. "Huh, that's really close," he mumbled, starting the engine and pulling out as Shota buckled up. "That's a convenience store, right? The one with the homemade meat buns? Maybe the kids stopped for lunch." Doubtful, but there was a vague hope. It took almost no time at all to get there, but the seconds dragged for an eternity, marked by the slow ticking of the timer between updates. The sight of Shinso's bike, locked up at the rack out front, spotted from down the street, long before they even parked, was both terrifying and a relief. The kid had been here, at least, but if he wasn't anymore, he hadn't left of his own volition. Shinso loved that bike. It was one of his most prized possessions. Every weekend, he spent an hour or more in almost a trance as he did maintenance, and every morning, before school, he'd go for a ride around campus, early enough that some of Shota's most dedicated students were already starting their early morning runs. Shinso wouldn't willingly leave it behind. Shota was out of the car before Hazashi even got it in park, and while he usually would have earned at least a frustrated huff for that, his husband was right behind him, only remembering to lock the doors when they got to the sidewalk. Barely sparing the front windows a glance, they pushed through the unlocked doors, splitting off as Shota went to check the aisles, and Hazashi went to talk to the elderly man behind the counter. "Hey, you remember the kid who rode the bike in?" he asked conversationally, motioning to the bike rack with a jerk of his head. As much as he tried to keep his voice casual, an attempt to keep others from panicking as much as it was to prevent from anybody being tipped off, Shota could hear the note of worry. He found himself caught between the desire to linger and listen, and his drive to pace the aisles and check the bathrooms for clues to his students' whereabouts. The former won out as he heard the cashier's reply. "Oh, yeah. I was wondering about that, actually. The kid came in a few hours ago, I think. Tall, purple hair, kinda skinny." That was Shinso. "You see where he went?" Shota asked, moving to stand beside Hazashi. "Left with a few boys pretty much right after stopping in. I thought it was weird they left without buying anything and without his bike, but I figured he'd come back for it eventually," he said, all too casual. and Shota wanted to think him involved, or at least smack him for being so blasé, but he only huffed and turned away. He scanned the ceiling and corners. Places like this had security cameras, and if Shinso's habits held out, he'd have tried to get spotted by one. It was a precaution for prejudice against his quirk, Shota figured. Whenever he spoke to an authority figure or dealt with a group, Shinso checked for cameras. If he wasn't in direct line of sight of one, he tried to move the conversation there. He was always aware of where they were and wherever he was, looking up at the ceiling when he entered a room to find them and how much they could see. It had taken Shota a few months to spot the habit, and a while longer to understand what Shinso was looking for when he scanned a new room. But his suspicions had been confirmed when he asked the teenager about it. If there was video proof that he hadn't done anything wrong, not even a mob of eyewitness accounts could contradict it. Cameras didn't lie unless someone made them. You see where he went? He's a UA student, and he's late getting back to the dorms. We're looking... Shota interrupted Hisashi, nudging his shoulder and pointing out the bubble security camera clinging to the ceiling. Camera. He addressed his next question to the cashier, who seemed to finally grasp the seriousness of this situation. Is it recording? You have access to them? Of course. I have the computer in the back. I'm not sure where they went, but the boys seemed to know him. I figured they were classmates or friends, he offered, pushing back off the counter and wringing his hands anxiously. At least his worry seemed sincere, though Shota hadn't marked him off the list of suspects responsible for his kid's disappearance. You mind if I check those? Don't worry, I'm a hero. Licensed and everything. Hisashi fished the license out of his pocket to show him, and recognition lit up on the man's face. Present Mike? He gaped, eyes boggling as he looked back and forth between the photo and Hisashi's face as if to confirm it. Shota stopped listening, leaving the store with a shake of his head as he fished out his phone to recheck the app. Despite the events and an unfortunate amount of scrutiny, he was still largely unrecognizable in his hero costume. Shaving, dressing even vaguely nice, and tying his hair back was apparently enough to fool Japan. They were still right on top of the tracker, but when Shota tried to zoom in for a more precise location, it only showed a circular overlay of the area. He growled at the uselessness of technology and called Shinso again. 1 ring, 2. Wait a second. He pulled the phone away from his ear, and there it was, a slight echo. The jaunty ringtone that comes standard with Shinso's phone, faint, where it coincided, slightly out of time with the tone from Shota's phone. It cut off suddenly with the answering machine, but he hung up and redialed. 1 moment, 1 ring, and there it was again, faint enough to be mistaken for hearing things. Shinso's phone was nearby. He just hoped Shinso was with it. Hisashi, come out here, he called, even as he followed the sound, moving around towards the alley beside the store. Though through a gate and a wire fence, the sound got louder, a little closer. He held his breath, afraid of what he might find. Show? He heard Hisashi call from out front. The battered plastic phone sat in the junction between where the building and the next door extended further back, and the alley opened into an empty asphalt lot behind the store. When Shota went to pick it up, hanging up his phone, something in the lot caught his eye. His blood ran ice cold. Hisashi! This was bad. Hitoshi was pretty sure this constituted as really, really bad. He wasn't sure how long he'd been laying there, baking in the sun, but every inch of exposed skin felt tight and hot, cooked. He stopped sweating at some point. Even his clothes had dried, leaving them stiff and uncomfortable. He was dizzy and nauseated too, and so fucking thirsty he couldn't even swallow anymore. His mouth was so dry. His head ached like he'd overused his quirk, and part of it was the dehydration, but the rest probably had something to do without his head had been slammed into the ground a few too many times. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore, or the foot that was tied up, though he turned onto his side to at least keep gravity from depriving them of blood. Around the time he'd realized how long it'd been, he tried struggling again and managed to uncover the eye closest to the asphalt. It'd probably done more harm than good, though. The capture scarf wrapped around his neck was so tight, his breathing wheezed, and had pinched painfully back when he'd had enough saliva to swallow. He worried about damage to his throat, and just how numb his hands and foot were. Recovery Girl couldn't heal cells if they were just plain dead. Frankly, he wasn't sure if he wasn't going to be the one who was dead. It'd been a long time, or at least felt like it, and while he'd been convinced someone would find him eventually, now he wasn't so sure. He felt like he was dying. He was fading in and out, having trouble concentrating, and he couldn't remember if these were the symptoms of heat stroke or heat exhaustion. Either way, he was probably dangerously dehydrated. Not sweating was bad. The worst part, he figured, was that he could see his water bottle, still almost full, lying just a meter or two away, taunting him with its proximity. With how he was tied up, it might as well have been on the other side of the world. So close, yet so out of reach. Hitoshi was beginning to think he shouldn't have woken up that morning. The thought felt familiar, but through the haze and dizziness and confusion, he was having a hard time thinking in general. He drifted, only vaguely aware of the heat beating down on him and the pain all over, concentrated in his head, until he heard music. Maybe. It was hard to tell. He halfway convinced himself he was hearing things, maybe even going insane, delirious from the sun, concussed and dying of thirst. He figured madness was the logical next step. But then it stopped. He was left in the quiet, an unbearable, oppressive heat. It was hard to tell how much time had passed. A few seconds, a minute, an hour. But eventually, the music started again, and again, and again. Like a song stuck on loop, but only a dozen or so seconds long. Wait, he recognized the music. It wasn't actually music, though. It was his ringtone, annoyingly cheery and too loud. Somebody was calling him repeatedly. Had he been gone so long that people were worrying? Was somebody looking for him? The fear that he was just hearing things that weren't there, a manifestation of his desperate hope for rescue conjured by likely severe concussion and heat stroke, sat just at the edge of his consciousness, vague enough to confuse him, but present enough for the anxiety to curl tight around his stomach. Where was his phone, anyway? It sounded far off, but he always tried to keep it on him, especially if he was going anywhere. Had he dropped it? The ground was hot underneath Hitoshi's cheek, and he was so damn thirsty. And tired, he realized. Had he laid down in the sun for a nap? It was too hot for that. Why would he do that? The ringtone again. Hitoshi needed to answer his phone. It was probably important. Someone was trying really hard to get a hold of him, and it was rude not to answer when he wasn't busy. But he was so tired, and his limbs wouldn't move. He tried to get his hands under him and push himself up, but something pinched tight around his arms and throat. He wheezed at the sudden pressure. Maybe he'd just have to call them back. As he closed his eyes, tempted to just drift away again, he heard a new noise. It was muffled, like there was cotton in his ears, but definitely not his phone. It was lower, different, and a lot closer. He tried to think, to figure out what the sound was, but it was like moving through mud, His head hurt so badly. Hopefully, whatever it was would stop soon and let him sleep off the headache. But no, that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted someone to find him, right? He wasn't hiding. Maybe he was lost. Someone was there. There was a hand on Hitoshi's side. He tried to jerk away from it. He was too hot to be touched. He just wanted to be left alone, but his body wasn't listening. He tried to tell the guy to fuck off, but something was in his mouth, pulled tight to chafe against the corners and his cheeks. Somebody was touching him. Hands were rolling him onto his front, touching his back, his arms, and he panicked. Not again. Please, no, not again. Shota slid the last few feet to his student, destroying the knees of his jumpsuit in his haste to get to Shinso faster. The teenager was lying on his side, his own capture weapon wrapped around him in a haphazard knot, far from something that could have come from a failed attempt at usage, though this was far too deliberate to have been an accident. Somebody had intentionally tied Shinso up and left him in the sun. Maybe they hadn't intended to leave him to die, but who knows how long he'd been there, without water or shade. His skin was dangerously red, and his clothing looked like it'd been sweated through, but the sweat baked away in the heat. Shinso, kid, I'm here now. It's okay, he said, grabbing his knife from the sheath on his back to cut the capture scarf. It may have been his first one, the one made for him back in high school, and Shinso's first now. But it needed to be cut, and he could get the damn thing repaired. Hell, he might not even need to. He wouldn't blame the kid if he never wanted to touch the thing again after someone used it to do this. It had been used to gag and blindfold him, and it had been wrapped tightly around his throat. Shota could see the pressure it put on the delicate cartilage in the way it dimpled the skin. It's okay, Hitoshi. I'll get you out of this. I promise. Just hold on. The fact that Shinso wasn't sweating anymore and only barely reacted when Shota placed a hand on his side, seemingly unaware of his surroundings, was dangerous. Terrifying. Heat stroke, dehydration, and the cut on his forehead, surrounded by bruises and dried, flaking blood, spoke of head trauma. Shinso needed a hospital now. Sho? Oh, fuck! What the hell happened? Hisashi had finally made it back to them, and Shota barely spared him a glance. Ambulance, now! He's got heat stroke and head trauma. As he moved to roll Shinso onto his stomach to have better access to the bindings, the previously unresponsive body under his hands came violently alive. Shinso bucked and kicked, trying to twist back over and away from Shota. He made desperate, frantic noises through the gag, his single exposed eye widely searching but unseeing as he tried to get away. It retched something awful in Shota's chest, and he grabbed Shinso by the upper arms to keep him from making the road rash and burns, open sores on every inch of his exposed skin, sticky under Shota's fingers. Any worse. Kid, Shinso, Hitoshi, it's me. It's Aizawa. I'm trying to get you free. Hold on. All the struggling was pulling the cloth tighter around his neck. Shota could hear how the teenager struggled to breathe through the gag and pressure. He needed to get it off him. Pinning the kid down with a forearm across his back after abandoning the task of getting Shinso to recognize him. The way the body under the pressure shuddered with ragged, desperate sobs made Shota sick. He kept talking, hoping something would break through the panic and delirium. It's okay. It's okay. Hold on, he breathed, sawing through the metal and fabric weave of the weapon. Never had the durability of the cloth been so apparent than when he desperately needed it to give way. Behind him, Hisashi was on the phone. He couldn't hear the conversation, too focused on his task. As soon as the knife cut through the last fibers of the line between Shinso's wrists and throat, he hastened to start unwinding it, helped along as Hisashi appeared at his side. "Ambulance is on its way, kiddo. Just hold on," he said, out of breath and frantic. His phone was on the ground by him, abandoned now that help was coming. The blindfold came way, but Shinso didn't seem to see them, wildly thrashing and desperately pulling air through his nose now that his airways weren't restricted. Shota could see how his teeth bit down on the fabric of the scarf and the way it chafed at the kid's lips and cheeks as he twisted and writhed. It should have started loosening, but a knot under the layers wrapped around Shinso's head held the gag in place. Shota cursed, fighting with the knot for barely a moment before the movement of Shinso's body yanked it out of his grasp. "Kid, please," he pleaded, wiggling his fingers under the taut fiber at Shinso's cheek to try to work it out of his mouth that way. Hisashi took the teenager's thrashing head in both hands to keep him from smashing it against the ground, holding it as still as possible. "Hold on, hold on, hold on," he murmured like a mantra, like a prayer, brushing his thumb over Shinso's temples in an effort to soothe him. With the scarf cut, the lengths around Shinso's arms started to unravel, and the more mobility he got, the worse he thrashed. Adrenaline was overpowering the exhaustion and injuries, but this was dangerous. They didn't know how injured Shinso was. When Shota finally worked the gag loose enough to pull it down over Shinso's chin to hang limp around his neck, the teenager immediately started screaming, voice ragged and pained. "Get off me! Let me go! Get off!" Hisashi answered before Shota could stop him. "Shinso, stop!" His grip on Shinso went slack, eyes clouding over as brainwashing took control. Before Shota could erase the effects, though, a fist connected with his jaw and knocked him flat on his ass. It didn't really hurt. Shinso was too weak and frantic, not in any position to put the necessary force behind it. But it still dazed him. "Get away from me!" Hisashi went to comply, but Shota activated Erasure, canceling Shinso's control, even as he gathered the kid up into his arms and dragged him close. Chest to chest, his face pressed to the kid's shoulder, and his arms pinning Shinso's to his sides. It was all he could think to do to restrain him without hurting him further. Shinso sobbed, weakly writhing. No, please don't. Please stop. Let go of me. Please," he begged, voice hoarse and broken around his pleading. Shota ached to respond, to reassure his kid, promises that he wouldn't hurt him, that it'd be okay, that he was safe. His heart broke at the ragged, hiccuping breaths Shinso struggled to take, the quiet pleading that broke down into whimpers. All he could do was hold tight, rocking them gently. Shota could only imagine the nightmares the kid's delirious mind conjured, and he felt sick at the implications. "The ambulance is here, Shinso. You'll be okay. It's okay," Hisashi murmured, running a hand through Shinso's greasy, wild hair. A shudder racked the kid's frame, but what little fight was left in him drained out all at once. He sagged, boneless in Shota's hold, gasping for air, hands clawing desperately at what little of his mentor he could reach. Shota shifted his hold to let those arms wrap around him, twisting tight in the fabric of his jumpsuit. "Aizawa?" Shinso gasped, shaking terribly, and Shota's relief at that simple sign of recognition couldn't have been understated. "Where? What?" he whimpered, gasping for breath that only broke into another ragged sob. It's okay, Hitoshi. The ambulance is here. You're gonna be fine." In the panic, Shota had missed the sirens, but sure enough, paramedics came around the corner and into the lot. Hands came up to take Shinso from his arms, intent to move him to the gurney they'd brought. But even if Shota didn't have the sudden, irrational need to hold on to his kid and never let go, the way Shinso jerked away, nearly knocking them both over, had him stopping them anyway. Shinzo muffled a sob into his shoulder. The kid was crying. His whole body shook with it, but there weren't any tears. "He's delirious and afraid. You're going to have to sedate him," he explained quietly, holding tighter to the distraught teenager in his arms and rubbing his back gently. Another series of heaving, frantic sobs racked Shinzo's frame, and Shota hushed him gently, murmuring quiet noises into the kid's hair. One of the paramedics hastily rolled off her gloves and reached out to touch the tips of all 5 fingers on the back of Shinzo's neck. The effect was near instantaneous. His breath hiccuped once, twice, then eased and evened out, his body going limp and head lolling to rest against Shota's neck, pillowed by the many coils of the capture scarf. The skin on his face where it touched Shota's exposed neck and cheek burned. Letting go of the now sleeping teen was a lot harder than it should have been, especially when it was just to get Shinzo to the medical care he so desperately needed. But he still managed it, stepping back to give the paramedics room. While the woman put her glove back on, she turned to Shota and Hisashi. "What happened? Tell me as quickly as you can," she demanded, as her partner got the rest of the cloth unwound and pulled away from Shinzo's body, undoing the knot around his ankle and throat with a touch of his fingers so he could lie him flat on the gurney. "We found him tied up here, and he's been here for a few hours at least. Head wound, delirious, only just recognized us. The cloth was wrapped around his neck and face." Thank God Hisashi had been there, because Shota couldn't concentrate beyond watching the paramedics strap his kid onto the gurney. He flexed his fingers into his palms, anxious as they moved to take him away, desperate to go with them, to stay with his kid. When had he started thinking Shinzo as his? A hand on his back pushed him gently along. "Go, Sho. I'll handle things here." He went, and the medics didn't stop him. Hitoshi had suffered very few headaches worse than the one that tried its hardest to split his head open when he woke up next. Maybe the one after the sports festival. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, a sharp throbbing that coincided with the soft beeping of something nearby. Elsewhere in the room, he heard the gentle murmur of a TV. When he cracked his eyes open, the ceiling above him was blurry, slowly coming into focus as he blinked a few times. The sound wasn't making the headache worse, and the lights only hurt because they were bright, stinging his eyes. Usually, sounds and light made his migraines worse, but maybe this wasn't a migraine. This wasn't his dorm room. His dorm only had a single overhead light that he never used. Not the fluorescent panels used in the school and office buildings. That beeping wasn't right either. Nothing in his room made that sort of noise. Slow, rhythmic, in time with his heartbeat. Outside the room, he heard an intercom. The voice was too metallic and garbled to make out the words. Hospital. He was in a hospital. Why, though? Thinking hurt, and Hitoshi closed his eyes, trying to take stock of his body. His mouth was so dry that he was having difficulty swallowing. His whole body hurt, a deep ache alongside a surface-level burning, and he hated he couldn't remember what had happened. Everything was heavy, and his eyes were gummy and lashes heavy and gritty with sleep. When he went to reach up and rub it away, though, his arm only moved a 6 centimeters before something stopped him. Something jangled noisily, and there was pressure around his wrist. Uncomprehending, he tried the other hand, only for the same results. He couldn't move his hands. His hands were tied down, and he couldn't move. Panic gripped his chest, and he tried to yank his arms free, kicking his feet to throw the covers off, only to find his legs similarly restrained to the hospital bed. Padded leather cuffs encircled his wrists and ankles, and he gasped for air as he tried to twist free. He needed to get away. Even though pulling his arms hurt, he didn't care. He'd break his fucking thumbs if he had to. Then there were hands grabbing him, holding him down. He fought even harder, desperately throwing his quirk out. Get off! Hitoshi, calm down. You're safe now. He recognized that voice. That was Aizawa. Hitoshi's brain felt like it'd been submerged into static, a slight pressure like a heavy blanket around his head, and he forced his eyes to focus. Calloused hands were firmly clasped around his, but the grip wasn't painful. When he finally met Aizawa's eyes, they were red, his hair floating around his head with the activation of his quirk. There you are. Breathe, kid. Just breathe for me. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Hitoshi's heart rate calmed as he gasped and struggled to follow Aizawa's coaching, staring into those eyes as they faded to black, and his teacher's hair fell back around his face, and the heavy weight and soft static of erasure falling with it. Even when he faltered, Aizawa kept going, not looking away from Hitoshi's face, and breathing got more manageable, easier. Aizawa was here. Aizawa was safe. The door behind Aizawa opened, and a nurse threw herself through in a panic, no doubt summoned by the rapid beeping of the heart monitor. Hitoshi could only hear the frantic noise now that the panic had faded. Aizawa looked flabbergasted by the intrusion, squeezing Hitoshi's hands to calm him, and looking back over his shoulder at the man. Hitoshi followed his gaze, seeing the coffee spilled on the ground, the paper cup half crushed under the nurse's foot. Give us a minute, his mentor snapped, and a few moments of silent arguing followed until the door was finally closed. They went through one more round of breathing exercises to calm the erratic beat of Hitoshi's heart and the way his chest hitched when he tried to breathe deep. But eventually, things settled. He blinked at Aizawa, face wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. Aizawa? There we go. You with me, Hitoshi? He asked, rubbing his thumb over the insides of Hitoshi's wrists, and the usage of his first name felt odd, new, comforting. It sounded nice coming from his teacher, and he felt a little pathetic for thinking so. When was the last time somebody called him by his given name, though? Hitoshi? Right, he hadn't answered. Yeah. He grimaced at the painful rasp of his voice, like gravel in his throat. It was so dry. He settled for nodding instead. Good, good. I'm going to undo these restraints, then, he said, voice low and cautious, and Hitoshi's face went cold when Aizawa let go. They put these on you because you kept lashing out when you woke up. You've been in and out of sedation for about 2 days now. As he spoke, he carefully reached down to undo the cuff on his wrist closest to him, moving around with careful, over-exaggerated movements of someone dealing with a scared animal. Hitoshi flushed with shame. He didn't remember waking up before now. Not since. It hurt to try and remember what happened, but something had to have happened. He hurt too much for it not to have. Training accident? Villain attack? That felt closer. Hitoshi tried to reach across and undo his other wrist, but his movements were too clumsy and uncoordinated, and Aizawa did it for him anyway. Only now did he notice the IV line trailing down to his inner elbow from the bag on the stand by the bed. His other elbow was bruised darkly, as were both of his wrists. He glanced down at his legs, bare from how short the hospital gown was. There were more bruises around one ankle, and the same calf and thigh. Every bruise was accompanied by friction burns, like when he got too tangled up with his capture scarf. painful even without anything touching them. His capture scarf. Ah, that was it. He remembered now. Or at least, he remembered some of it. He'd been jumped. They'd used his capture scarf to tie him up and left him to be found. He remembered the sun beating down on his skin and the pain from where they'd hit his head on the asphalt and the panic. Reaching up to touch the bandage on his temple, he tried to push that bit down. The fear of what they'd do to him, of what would happen to him. That same panic had been there again, only just faded when he woke up restrained. A cup with only a little water and a straw was held in front of his mouth, and he gratefully reached up to steady it as he drank. It hurt to swallow, but the cool water was glorious and soothed his dry mouth and throat. It was gone all too soon. Can I have some more? He asked nervously, watching Aizawa put the cup to the side.
In a little bit. You had pretty severe heat stroke, and the doctors want to limit your fluid intake for a while. The sedatives can make you nauseous too, and you don't need to lose any more fluids by throwing up.
Hitoshi nodded, disappointed. He didn't have it in him to argue. He was a little nauseated, stomach feeling pinched and uneasy. After a moment of slightly uncomfortable silence, Aizawa pressed the call button for the nurse to return. It was another disappointment. Hitoshi didn't want to be touched by anyone right now, though he wouldn't say no to Aizawa holding his hand again, and felt pathetic for that too. They asked so many questions too, and his head hurt even worse by the time they were done. He hoped whatever they put in his IV for pain before they left would help soon. At least they okayed him for a little more water, which Aizawa helped him greedily drink. Never had tap water tasted so good. The same awkward silence fell when the cup was empty and put aside again, suffocating and heavy. Aizawa sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Hitoshi's bed, head down and hands clasped where his forearms rested on his knees, and Hitoshi watched him from where he lay, slightly propped up in the hospital bed. He looked rough. Even without being able to see his mentor's face, Hitoshi could tell by the slope of his back, the tension in his shoulders, and the way he rubbed one thumb along the other, a nervous habit he'd noticed over the months of training together. That Aizawa was upset. Eventually, Hitoshi's anxiety got the better of him.
I'm sorry,
he croaked. The look Aizawa gave him was confused, with a brow furrowed with concern, and his head tilted slightly. Suddenly, those dark eyes were too much, and Hitoshi looked away, fidgeting with the paper bracelet around his wrist.
Shinso, why are you sorry?
He asked, voice carefully neutral, and Hitoshi missed his name already. Hitoshi could only shrug, bringing his shoulders up to his ears and ducking his head. Weirdly enough, he missed his capture scarf. No matter what it'd been used to do to him, he longed to hide his expression in its coils, to curl his fingers in the length of it and the flow around the motions of his usage just for something to do with his hands. Something was bothering his teacher, and he was the cause of it. That made it his fault, right? So he apologized and felt like that was the right thing to do. He was learning to be a hero, but he'd lost to 3 nobodies who weren't even that much bigger than him. Bringing his capture scarf in his backpack when he shouldn't have was stupid, probably breaking some rule too. He should have done better, fought them off, or brainwashed the guys when he had the chance. Something. Maybe Aizawa could see the reasoning on his face, but he sighed and reached out to touch Hitoshi's arm, hand big and warm, his hold firm but not restraining. It was comforting. It surprised him so badly that he looked up at his mentor without thinking, blinking owlishly.
Shinso, Hitoshi,
he started, and he was using his given name again, making Hitoshi feel warm, cared for, like Aizawa cared.
You have nothing to be sorry for. You were attacked. You could have died. Nearly died. If you're apologizing for lashing out at the staff, you weren't even conscious when you did it. And I'm rather sure you were having nightmares. Maybe even flashbacks,
he said, voice growing soft and quiet. The look on Aizawa's face was pained, and his next question came out in fits and starts, like he didn't want to ask, but had to.
Did they, those men, do you remember if they did anything to you?
Hitoshi knew what he meant and closed his eyes tight against the memory. They hadn't, thank God, but he still remembered the weight of the person sitting on his back, of the boy straddling his legs.
Hitoshi.
At Aizawa's devastated, heartbroken tone, he answered quickly.
No, they didn't do that. I thought they were going to, but they just went through my pockets after they...
He shrugged a shoulder awkwardly, forcing his eyes open but staring at his hands.
I got lucky. No, just because it wasn't worse doesn't mean you were lucky for what happened to you. It means it wasn't worse.
His teacher's tone, adamant, firm, like it was common sense and irrefutable, made Hitoshi feel a little better about not feeling lucky. Silence fell again, and Aizawa let his hand drop away. Hitoshi missed it immediately and wrapped his arms around himself to keep from asking Aizawa to hold his hand again. He kind of wanted a hug, but couldn't bring himself to ask.
Kid, you tell me if they did anything else, right?
Aizawa asked, reaching out to rest his hand, palm up, on the bed, like an offer. Hitoshi looked at it, feeling a tightness in his chest and throat that felt like it'd choke him. He wanted to cry, to talk about everything that ever happened to him. Aizawa made him feel so fucking safe. He just nodded, though, reaching out to hold Aizawa's hand and hoping that he hadn't misunderstood the offer. The gentle squeeze loosened the hold his anxiety had on his lungs.
Promise?
It sounded so childish, coming from the usually stoic man, and Hitoshi couldn't help a wet laugh.
Yeah, I promise. They didn't do anything like that.
When he peeked at Aizawa out of the corner of his eye, there was a slight quirk to his mouth, the hint of a smile.
Good. How much do you remember of what happened?
Hitoshi shrugged.
Not a lot. I remember the convenience store. They were talking about something. Wanted me to brainwash someone to help them rob it. I said no. Things got violent.
He reached up to touch his head again, thumbing the edge of the gauze on his temple.
While I was trying to fight, one of them went through my bag, found my binding cloth, and...
He trailed off, shrugging a little helplessly. Bondage shit. That's what they called it. Even if they hadn't done it, they had it on their minds, using language like that. It made Hitoshi sick to think about. He swallowed thickly.
Left me there. Anything after that?
Another shrug as he rubbed at his face. It stung like a sunburn, the tight heat of cooked skin.
Not really. I laid there for a long time. I remember my phone ringing, I think.
Aizawa nodded.
I could hear it from the sidewalk. Kept calling to find it. And you.
He explained quietly, and Hitoshi nodded, moving to rub the back of his neck, but wincing when the gentle touch hurt. The skin was inflamed, just like the bruises and friction burns on the rest of him. He grimaced, wondering just how messed up he was. As if reading his mind, Aizawa asked,
"You want a rundown of your injuries?"
Nodding, Hitoshi turned his full attention to his teacher, and the look on the man's face was almost fond.
"Yeah, please. That'd be really nice." "Right."
Aizawa shook his head before sighing, preparing himself, it seemed.
"Road rash and burns from the asphalt on your face."
Hitoshi reached to touch his other cheek, wincing at the slightly dulled pain of touching the wound through the bandage.
"Probably won't scar, but recovery girl will be by later to help with that and everything else. Her first visit was to take care of your concussion, but the pressure cut's still there. That will definitely scar. Bruises and friction burns from where you were tied up. Pretty bad sunburn, heat stroke, severe dehydration. You were a mess, kid."
The soft look in his mentor's eyes had Hitoshi looking away, reaching up to rub fingers through his disgustingly greasy hair. God, he needed a shower.
"Well, I figured I might get a head start on being part of your problem class, you know, help you with your gray hair problem."
He motioned vaguely, hoping his flippant remark might lighten the mood. Aizawa groaned, his expression pained and exhausted, as he reached up to pinch the bridge of his nose.
"Please don't. I already have enough trouble with the first years. I don't need you helping."
He bemoaned, flopping back dramatically into the uncomfortable hospital chair. Hitoshi laughed, ducking his head to try and stifle it into his shoulder, and finally letting go of his mentor's hand.
"Yeah, I heard about Midoriya and Explosion Boy, Bakugo. Explosion Boy, fighting just before the term started. Hound Dog was pretty pissed."
Despite how much his whole body hurt and the headache still throbbed behind his eyes, talking to Aizawa like it was just any other day was nice, familiar. He was comfortable just sitting there. The hospital and the memories it brought back were easier to ignore with him there. Something occurred to Aizawa as he gave him a tired smile. The shadows under the man's eyes were darker than usual, his hair greasier where it hung around his face, half pulled back into a messy bun. There was an exhaustion to his features that Hitoshi hadn't seen since the days immediately after the Camino Ward incident. Had he been here the whole time? For the 2 days Hitoshi was in and out of sedation, had Aizawa stayed with him?
Have you...
He glanced away, chewing on the inside of his cheek when he tried to find the right way to ask. He had to ask, though. He had to know. Aizawa misinterpreted his question, scowling at the ground as he sat up again.
"Yeah, we got the guys who attacked you. That whole camera thing you do helped, you know. I know it's rooted in something unfortunate, but the police have their names and faces because of it."
His voice was barely restrained, hiding an anger Hitoshi could see in the fire in his dark eyes.
"The police will want to talk to you about everything now that you're awake, but that can wait till you're a little better."
That wasn't what Hitoshi expected. He honestly didn't expect anything to happen to the boys who attacked him. It wasn't the first time he'd been jumped, though he supposed it was likely the worst. But that was just because he'd been left out in the sun. Usually, cops didn't get involved. He'd been left battered and bruised in the trash before, and he was the one who got in trouble. Noting his silence, Aizawa looked over at him. That fire faded, something else taking its place. Concern, a little bit of disbelief, overwhelmingly despair.
"Hitoshi, you didn't think we wouldn't care, did you? That we'd let them just get away with it?"
Caught, Hitoshi shrugged, looking away and picking idly at the blanket.
"Hitoshi,
It was going to suck when it went back to Shinso. Hearing his first name for the first time in years made him think of his mom and his few pleasant memories of her. It left a warm, fuzzy, comforting feeling in his chest that smothered out the awkward squirming in his stomach at getting called out.
Hitoshi, you nearly died. 3 adults assaulted you in broad daylight. Adults, Hitoshi. All 3 were 18. They attacked and nearly killed you. A child.
Hitoshi wanted to protest at being called a child, but maybe felt now wasn't the best time.
You were left out there for 3 hours on the hottest day of the year so far. There were so many things wrong with what happened. So many things we can charge them with. And several people had to remind me I'm a hero, not a vigilante. And that means I can't beat the shit out of those 3 for what they've done.
Hitoshi could only gawk at him, blinking owlishly, his mouth slightly agape. All that anger. Aizawa was threatening violence against civilians. And it was for him? All the rage that built up as Aizawa spoke left his teacher with a massive sigh, and he reached up to rub his eyes.
Midnight has been coming by every evening to check on you. Nezu has been covering my class so I could be here when you woke up,
he said, before snorting, opening an eye to look at Hitoshi through his fingers.
It worked out well, since you kept trying to use your quirk when you woke up panicking.
Shame had Hitoshi ducking his head again. Aizawa had stayed for him, though. Being there to cancel his quirk sounded like a fortunate happenstance, and he hated that it even been necessary. But Aizawa had been there for Hitoshi, so he wouldn't be alone when he woke up. His chest felt tight at the implications, hot tears prickling behind his eyes as he nodded and took a slow, shuddering breath.
Inflicting Nezu on your kids for me? Geez, I feel special.
He laughed, the sound wet and rough. Aizawa snorted, looking a little smug.
They deserve it.
Things went quiet again, as Hitoshi fidgeted with the blanket. Despite what happened and how it no doubt affected his life like all his previous traumas had, he was happy. Aizawa was there for him, and Hitoshi couldn't remember the last time anybody had been there for him, much less an adult who mattered. Because of Aizawa, he hadn't woken up alone. Hitoshi had woken up alone in a hospital enough for a lifetime.
Hey, Mr. Aizawa,
he said, tentative and quiet.
Yeah? Thanks for being here when I woke up and going after the guys and caring, I guess.
He muttered, reaching up to rub the back of his neck again and wincing when it hurt. He shifted to touch the back of his head instead, idly pulling at the tangles. When Aizawa sighed, he felt like what he'd said was the wrong thing. But then, a warm, scarred hand was nudging him to get his attention. He turned to meet his teacher's eyes.
Always, kid. I will always care about you. You deserve that, and so much more.
The way he said it made Hitoshi want to believe him. And that's all for that fic. Oh boy. This was long. I recorded the first 20 minutes a while ago, but after that I've been recording this pretty much nonstop with only a quick break for dinner. Pasta. But this is one of my favorite fics. I love this one so much. It is just, oh yeah, the hurt, the comfort, the just Dadzawa and Shinso, and it's amazing, and I love it, and it's the best, and oh my gosh, my voice hurts so much. Yeah. This fic is so great. I really, really love it, and I'm so happy that I get to podfic it. Yeah. And I'm recording this fic for Voice Team 2024 for the challenge Hello Stranger as the fic that I'm podficking from my Dear Podficker letter, aka a fic that is just perfect for me, which is, you know, obvious by how much I love it, and it's my favorite fic. It like fits what I put on my list. But no, this fic is so amazing. Like, if you guys liked it, please go into this description to click the link to the original work and go leave a kudos and a comment for the original author. This fic is so great, and I love it so much. But oh yeah, I really need to stop talking. My voice is just shredded. But yeah, that's all for now, and I'll see you guys next time.